several generations of people in the United States, the Soviet Union, and Europe fell asleep in fear. People expected that this was the night they would fall victim to a nuclear strike by an enemy country. Why did the Cold War, during which mankind has been threatened several times by nuclear weapons, begin? What was the confrontation between the US and the USSR during this long conflict, and who were their allies? Cold War causes. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged victorious. During the battle, they accumulated incredible military power, as well as political elites who were inclined to solve foreign policy issues with the help of their weapons. There was a deep ideological gap between the US and the USSR. The first one was generally democratic, but with a high level of social inequality. The second state was totalitarian, but it declared support for social equality. Therefore, it won the sympathy of many poor people who made up the majority of the world's population. In addition, communism, which was the state ideology of the USSR, proclaimed the need to fight capitalism. The latter was the economic platform of most developed European countries and the United States. The USSR and US had an aspiration to dominate the post-war world and Europe, which has been divided into spheres of influence between the capitalist and democratic US, France, Great Britain, and the communist USSR. Under the Yalta Agreements, the USSR gained control of Central and Eastern Europe, except for Greece. In the countries of the region, the Soviet leadership quickly created a puppet government, imposed severe censorship, carried out repression against opponents of the Soviet regime, nationalized large enterprises, and abolished democratic elections. This brutal expansion of the USSR in Europe, as well as the unwillingness to withdraw its troops from northern Iran, led to a crisis in relations between the Soviet state and the Western countries. Beginning of the Cold War. The official date of the Cold War beginning is considered to be Winston Churchill's speech at Fulton in 1946. In it, the former British Prime Minister described the actions of the USSR in the republics of Central Europe under its control as the formation of a communist totalitarian order behind the Iron Curtain. He called on the United States and Britain to be prepared to provide armed resistance to further Soviet expansion. A week later, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Stalin, compared Churchill to Hitler in an article. He hinted that the USSR was ready for a new war between the former allies of the anti-Hitler coalition. President Truman's doctrine escalated the situation further. It proclaimed the need for the U.S. allies to defend themselves decisively against the invasion of the USSR or the communist movements it supported. It also mentioned the possibility of a massive attack by nuclear warheads on the territory of the USSR in case of possible aggression by the latter. Under the Marshall Plan, Americans also provided substantial financial assistance to rebuild European countries, provided that there were no communists in the governments. The Soviet state did not have such economic power, so to help its countries, Stalin's satellites sharply increased plans for grain procurement in collective farms. This caused famine, with more than 1 million victims in Ukraine and Moldova. West Berlin blockade and the formation of NATO. After World War II, Germany was divided into occupation zones between the Western countries and the Soviet Union. The German capital, Berlin, was also divided into zones of control. The western part was under the control of the United States, Britain, and France, and was surrounded by the Soviet GDR. In June 1948, the USSR and East Germany began a blockade of West Berlin to induce the Western Allies to make concessions to the Soviet side during the formation of a future united Germany. The United States, with the support of England and France, arranged the delivery of essential goods by air throughout the year. Such provocations by the Soviet Union and fears of further communist expansion hastened the creation of an intergovernmental military defensive alliance, NATO, which, besides the US, Canada, Great Britain, and France, included several European countries. The arms race and confrontation in space. The military confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War was accompanied by a military buildup, as well as an arms race and technology. In the second half of the 1940s, the U.S. had an undeniable advantage in the quantity and quality of aviation. In addition, they were the only ones in the world to possess nuclear weapons. The situation changed slightly in 1949, when the USSR also created a nuclear bomb. The Soviet Union was more active in developing missile weapons to compensate for the backlog in aviation. Thus, the first intercontinental missile, R-7, capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, appeared in the USSR. The first artificial Earth satellite and the first human in orbit were launched into space on modifications of this Soviet missile. In response, the United States increased funding for the development of Atlas and Saturn rockets, which could serve as both intercontinental missiles and launch vehicles for spacecraft and artificial satellites. In the end, it paid off, and American astronauts, led by Neil Armstrong, landed on the moon in 1969 on a Saturn-like rocket. Another area of confrontation was the development of nuclear warheads. The number and total power of American warheads surpassed other countries until 1974. Then the palm passed to the USSR. In 1982, the combined power of strategic Soviet missiles was more than 8,000 megatons in TNT equivalent. The American variants were half as powerful. The Soviet Union also produced and detonated the most powerful Tsar Bomba. Its capacity was 56 megatons in TNT equivalent, more than 3,000 times that of the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. However, in the USSR at that time, there were no missiles that could deliver such a warhead to the territory of the enemy. Therefore, this action had an exceptionally demonstrative and intimidating nature. The economy of the Soviet Union lagged behind that of the United States. Per capita GDP was mostly half that of Americans, but the Soviet Union tried to be on par with the US, or even ahead of the Americans, in armaments. Therefore, the Soviet Union spent 42 to 60% of its budget on the defense and space industries. This was several times larger than the analogous percentage of the US budget that was allocated to this area. Over time, this became one of the reasons for the collapse of the communist superpower. Geographical expansion of the US-USSR confrontation. The creation of a nuclear warhead in the USSR increased the price and risks of a direct war between the two superpowers. For this reason, they waged proxy wars in which the US helped countries in their struggle against communism, and the USSR assisted countries or national liberation socialist movements of the Third World in their wars with the US or European colonial empires. Thus, in the 1940s, the Soviet Union supported the struggle of the Greek communists against the Greek authorities of those times through the delivery of weapons, finances, and provisions. The USSR also supported the Chinese communist partisans against the Chinese Kuomintang, the Vietnamese and Lao communist partisans against France in French Indochina, and the Malaysian communists fighting against the British. By assisting many national liberation movements in Asia and Africa, the USSR brutally suppressed its national movements. Thus, from 1945 to 1953, more than 750,000 Ukrainian, Belarusian, Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian nationalists and members of their families, or those suspected of cooperating with them, found themselves in prisons and special settlements in the Gulag. The Korean War. The North Korean troops, which were heavily supported by the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union, and which included significant additional Chinese units and fictitious volunteers, started the war in South Korea in June 1950. The latter, at the time, was supported by the US and Western democracies. By October, communist forces had succeeded in capturing almost all of Korea, except the Pusan perimeter. This forced America to move 70,000 soldiers from Japan to aid its ally. In addition, due to the démarche of the USSR, the US gained diplomatic support from the UN, under whose auspices the war against the communist aggressors was formally taking place. By November, US, South Korean, and UN forces had defeated the North Korean army and Chinese pseudo-volunteers and almost reached the northern border of North Korea. This prompted the Soviet Union and China to intervene directly in this war. The Chinese army, which numbered over 1 billion soldiers, and the 26,000-strong Soviet anti-aircraft force, helped push back the forces of the US, South Korea, and their allies to almost the 38th parallel north. It used to be the border between the two parts of Korea. Despite its numerical superiority, the Communist coalition failed to break the resistance of the UN forces led by the US. The war ended in 1953 without significant territorial gains. However, the human toll on both sides of the conflict was considerable. China lost up to 400,000 soldiers. The United States lost 40,000. South Korea lost 123,000. And North Korea lost 112,000. Another 120,000 were captured. The Berlin Crisis. The next round of confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union was the Berlin Crisis of 1961. During the crisis, the Soviet Union and the GDR issued an ultimatum to the Western Allies demanding that West Berlin, which was part of the Federal Republic of Germany, should be transferred to Communist East Germany. FRG and America refused, after which the USSR and East Germany began construction of the Berlin Wall in 166 kilometers with the help of their military. This wall was intended not only to secure all of West Berlin, isolating it, but also to make it impossible for citizens of the Communist East to escape to the Democratic West in the western part of Berlin. However, the escapes continued. After the construction of the wall and until its collapse, 1989, more than 5,000 people managed to escape to free West Germany. Another 127,000 were killed by GDR border guards. Cuban Missile Crisis. After the Socialist Revolution and the nationalization of foreign capital businesses by Fidel Castro, the U.S. broke off relations with Cuba and put economic and political pressure on it. This prompted Fidel to strengthen his relations with the Soviet Union and offer the Soviet authorities to place their nuclear missiles in Cuba in exchange for additional military and economic support. This disturbed the U.S. because earlier the eccentric leader of the USSR, Khrushchev, at a meeting with representatives of the United States, swore and promised to show Kuzka's mother. Some of the CIA saw it as a threat of a new Soviet nuclear weapons strike against the U.S. Accordingly, the American air and missile forces were preparing to launch a preemptive strike. The world was saved from an almost inevitable nuclear war by a conversation between Kennedy and Khrushchev. During this conversation, two leaders of the most powerful countries of the time agreed. Khrushchev decided to remove nuclear weapons from Cuba. In return, the United States withdrew its nuclear missile systems from Turkey. Vietnam War. After France's defeat and withdrawal from Southeast Asia, two states emerged in Vietnam: North Communist Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, which enjoyed U.S. support. Ho Chi Minh established a network of guerrilla communist organizations in the Republic of Vietnam, which fought for joining North Vietnam and received significant support from the locals due to the total corruption of the South Vietnamese government. To counter the spread of communist ideology and the armed intervention of North Vietnam in the South, in 1965, the United States decided to introduce its almost 500,000 army into the territory of the Republic of Vietnam and launch full-scale military action against Ho Chi Minh's communist regime. Despite a total advantage in military equipment, the U.S. and allied South Vietnam failed to defeat the regular and irregular North Vietnamese guerrilla forces that were supported with the material, technical, and human resources by the USSR and Communist China. The U.S. Army used mass aerial bombardment of North Vietnam and burning of the jungles of Laos and Cambodia, where the Communist rebels were based. But this did not bring the expected result. The loss of more than 50,000 dead American soldiers, the lack of significant strategic progress in achieving their military goals, and the total frustration of American society in this brutal tropical war prompted the U.S. to withdraw its army in 1973. South Vietnam fell to Communist forces 2 years later without American support. Soviet War in Afghanistan. In 1979, the USSR withdrew its troops to the formerly friendly state of Afghanistan. President Hafizullah Amin, whom the Soviet government considered to be an unreliable partner, was assassinated during the special operation. This behavior caused strong condemnation in the Islamic world, even in those states that were allies of the USSR. The major oil suppliers in the Arabian Peninsula reacted especially negatively to this invasion, and under the U.S. diplomatic initiative, they sharply increased their production and supply to the world market. This move precipitated a collapse in the price of fuel and led to a significant decline in the Soviet Union's economy, which exports consisted of 47% of fuel and electricity. The various tribes of Afghanistan began their struggle against the Soviet invasion by choosing guerrilla tactics. In addition, a significant number of Mujahideen fighters came from Arab countries and Pakistan to fight against Soviet troops in Afghanistan. Thanks to the numerical and technological superiority of the Soviet army, it was possible to quickly capture key cities and establish control over the most important transport hubs. However, moving inland into the mountainous country was difficult because there were mostly no ways for transport and armored vehicles. In addition, the insurgents were supported by the local population, and this, combined with better knowledge of the terrain, contributed to the local victories of the Afghan Mujahideen. The United States equipped the Afghan rebels with light infantry weapons and anti-aircraft Stinger missiles, which helped the Mujahideen fight the Soviet Air Force. In this battle in Afghanistan, the USSR lost between 15,000 and 45,000 people. The number of wounded Soviet soldiers was much higher, estimated at 400,000. These losses in battles for a mountainous agricultural country, deprived of valuable minerals and strategic importance, contributed to the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan. They also became a source of frustration for the ruling government in the USSR. The economic losses from reducing fuel prices and exorbitant military losses laid the foundations for the future collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Summary. The Cold War was the result of a fierce ideological and economic confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. This struggle resulted in a non-stop arms race, space races, and desperate attempts by both countries to maintain their influence at great cost, even in small states, as well as in local conflicts between the two sides during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The total and large-scale war was prevented by the occurrence of nuclear weapons that could destroy the planet in both countries. Therefore, the US and the Soviet Union waged proxy wars in other states, where the fans of the capitalist and communist world order fought among themselves. Alternatively, the parties provided support to the forces that fought against the Soviet or American invasion, respectively. The disproportionate militarization of the USSR's less developed economy, in which military spending accounted for up to 60% of the budget, the decline in oil prices, and the defeat in Afghanistan accelerated the exhaustion and collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. This date marked the formal end of the war, and marked the fact that only one superpower remained on the world's political scene, the US, which won the American-Soviet standoff.